Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Czech Christian Academy, in cooperation with the Faculty of Arts at the Charles University in Prague, please allow me to welcome you to a lecture as a part of the project supported by the Templeton Foundation, Faith and Belief of Non-Believers, which explores the globally growing segment of so-called nons. After very interesting lectures by Professor Linda Woodhead and Professor Tom Boudoir and Professor Charles Taylor, we are pleased to welcome here Professor Grace Davie, who will lecture today on the reflection on non-belief, typology, or spectrum. Grace Davie is a professor of sociology at the University of Exeter at the United Kingdom. Her research is focused on the sociology of religion with a particular emphasis on patterns of religion in Europe. She is also interested in the new theoretical paradigms that are emerging in the field, like multiple modernities. She is well known for her many articles and books like Religion in Britain since 1945, Believing Without Belonging, or Religion in Britain, a Persistent Paradox, or Religion in Public Life, Leveling the Ground, published in London 2017. Before I give her the floor, I would like to ask Professor Tomáš Halík to introduce us to the topic briefly. Thank you very much.
So, good evening, everybody. It's a great pleasure for us to see and to listen to Professor Davie. Her books are a great inspiration for us for many years. And this our meeting is part of our research project, Faith and Beliefs of so-called non-believers. We have chosen this topic because the Czech Republic is known as perhaps most atheistic country in Europe or even in the world, and we don't believe it. We think there is a very bright scala of spiritual attitudes, and that the number of the dogmatic believers and the number of dogmatic militant atheists is decreasing, and there is a lot of very different attitudes, like the agnostic, the apatheist, the spiritual seekers, the people they are choosing their own spiritual spiritual ways. There are many those spiritual but non-religious, and so on. And we would like to understand this word of so-called non-believers better. And we think that the category believers, non-believers, atheists, theists, is not appropriate to understand the spiritual situation of our time, and that perhaps we need to change these traditional categories of sociology of religion to understand better what is going on. So we have heard, as Robert mentioned already, several very good lectures, impulses, and we are very happy to have Professor Davie with us. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your welcome. I'm very, very pleased to join you in this important project. Let's take the first slide, if you may. Thank you. Now, I chose the title carefully because I wanted to introduce the notion that non-belief is a spectrum rather than typology. So next slide. Is it coming, the next one?
Yeah, we can see the next one.
You can, I can't. All right, that's fine, as long as I know what's happening. this is an overview of what I'm going to say. I'm getting a strong echo. Is there anything you can do to stop it?
Now it should be without the echo.
Excellent. My overview of what I'm going. Oh, that's excellent. Much, much better. I want to look at this question empirically, but starting first with some conceptual clarifications. How do we frame what is evidently a complex debate? And then I'm going to look at some comparative examples, some British, European, and indeed global examples, because I feel very strongly in this this particular subject that circumstances alter cases. This is clearly true in the question of religion and faith, but it's equally true in its obverse of non-religion or non-faith. And we need to be quite clear in our terminology and to think carefully what particular aspects of unbelief are showing in particular cases. And as I say, I think it is more realistic to talk about a spectrum from one end of firm belief to the other end of firm unbelief, but the middle is a very grey area. And those are the kind of areas, fields I want to unpack this evening. So can we go to the next slide, please? And my first point is that the vocabulary is very tricky. I mean, this is a big ask for you. You're not English speakers, at least most of you are not native speakers of English. And even those who are don't get this vocabulary right all the time. I often start with my students on encouraging them to distinguish between secularity, secularism, and secularization, because they all mean different things. They're often misused in the literature, which doesn't help. And the most important thing is to pay attention to the difference between descriptive terms and normative terms. Secular, for example, is an adjective that could be used both as a descriptive term, this or that or the other is secular, but it can also be normative. It can also be loaded, that secular is better or less good, depending on your point of view. Secularity is the least used and the most harmless term, if you like. It's simply a state of affairs of things being secular. It's not often used, but it is a good describing noun. Secularism is an ideology. It's quite different. You espouse secularism like you espouse feminism or communism. And secularization, of course, is a process. It's something that happens over time or doesn't, like modernization. Do they go together or do they not? That's something we will ask ourselves. And this is where I start often when I'm teaching students in Britain, that to sort that out before you begin. And equally, to remember that no religion and non-belief are not interchangeable terms. Those who claim no religion, as we will see in the next 2-3 slides, are not necessarily unbelievers. They may be, but they may not be. They're different ideas, and they should not be used interchangeably. So we go to the next slide and the example. And here I'm quoting my good friend and colleague, Linda Woodhead, who has also been talking to you. And she sees, she probably told you this already, the rise of no religion in Britain primarily as a conscious disaffiliation from organized religious groups, people who place themselves outside organized religion. These people are known as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, and they are in Britain pretty much a cultural majority. It depends a bit how you measure, but they are not straightforwardly secular. Only a minority, as Thomas Halleck has already said, are convinced atheists. There are maybes, maybe a God, doubters, I don't know, are just as present. And there are 5.5% among this group who definitely believe in God. We need to pay attention to detail. And I've given you the reference there. I'm sure Linda gave you that herself. It's a much quoted article. I do commend it to you. On my next slide, I will introduce another colleague, Lois Lee. I like her work very much. A book published in 2015. I can, of course, give you the references if you don't have them already. And Lois argues that unbelief can be as varied as belief, and to be properly understood, it requires equally careful scrutiny. You need to look closely at what people mean by unbelief. Note in particular the distinction that Lois Lee makes between absence and presence. I think this is very perceptive. She is trying to move away from the notion that absence, no belief, no religion, perhaps unbelief, are simply the opposite of religion. And they're what you get if you check the box saying no religion. It's a negative term. It's something you're not. And she wants to encourage us to think more positively about the non-religious, that they're substantively non-religious, and there is a presence here rather than an absence. You're looking carefully at what the people who say they have no religion are and do and think and how they live. For Lois Lee, non-religion and unbelief become not simply the absence of religion, but something that is actively expressed more often than not in the company of others. I will show you some examples of that a bit later on. Now, in the field in which you are working, I'm working, we often talk about the notion of lived religion. This is something richer and deeper than simply codes of belief or religious institutions. It's broader than that. And I wonder whether we should be asking the same of secular people. What is the secular equivalent of lived religion? Is there something called lived non-religion or lived unbelief, non-belief? How does it work out in the lives of people who take this choice? Fill it with something rather than see it as devoid of something. Okay, next slide. I recently, in the last 5-10 years, have become very aware of two things happening at once, both in Britain and more broadly in Europe. I think secularization is growing steadily. Quite what that means, of course, we can talk about for a long time. I don't see a reversal in that. But religious diversity is also growing, driven by immigration. And when I began learning in this field, which is a long time ago now, some 50 years ago, it was generally argued that the public sphere was secular, but religion would persist in the private sphere amongst individuals. People could be individually religious, even if they lived in secular societies with secular states. Now, gradually, I'm beginning to see a kind of reversal of that, because I don't see individual lives becoming, I think individual lives as well as public life can become very secular. I think this is what the recent turn to no religion is about. But at the same time, which is paradoxical, because of religious diversity, religion is more present in public life, in public discussion and public debate than it used to be. We have very heated debates, certainly in parts of West Europe, in Britain, about managing diversity. This is not necessarily what people expected to happen, but we have difficult issues to resolve of what is permitted, what isn't permitted, and different societies come to different different conclusions, for example, about dress codes and that kind of thing. And what I see, which I think is pertinent to what we're doing this evening, is that secularization, continuing secularization, leads to eroding practice and in some cases eroding belief. And that's a kind of drift. It's a bit by bit movement as societies change. But growing religious diversity does something quite different. It leads to the return of religion to public life, to the public sphere, to the public debate. And that can provoke some very sharp reactions, including strongly worded assertions of the secular. In other words, people don't like the re-emergence of religion in public debate or public life, and they react very sharply against that. Now, interestingly, Richard Dawkins used to be the example that we used to speak about, but I think he's faded very much from public discussion. I think that very sharp negative exclusion of religion from public life is not really viable. I mean, there may be some voices who still assert that, but we have to find some ways of managing quite a difficult public debate. I don't think we should ever pretend that this is an easy thing to deal with. So you have different trends provoking different reactions and a situation of some complexity which is emerging. I'm quoting Linda Woodhead again in my next slide. In Britain today, we have confident atheists and confident theists at the extremes of the spectrum, but they remain minorities in society, both the confident believers and the confident unbelievers. They are outnumbered by people who are agnostic or keep an open mind or believe in unseen forces and powers or a god or gods, who just think it's likely that there's something out there. And so we have this spectrum. This is partly where I get the idea of the spectrum from. Committed believers at one end, and do remember, in many societies, not all those committed believers are Christian. Some of the most committed believers in the West are Muslim or Jewish, or indeed other faiths, and the committed unbelievers at the other end. And you have every shade of grey in between. At what point on this spectrum does belief give way to unbelief? I think that's a very subtle question, and I think the answers are very variable. I mean, I'm pretty sure that not only do you get differences between people, but you get differences in the life cycle. People change their minds. They go in and out of this sort of half belief or half unbelief. I mean, sometimes I have used the kind of conversation that you would hear in a maternity hospital when people are giving birth, and the conversation is nearly always about something beyond. How did this happen? And the same things happen if you are with people when they pass from this life to another or not, depending on your point of view. But it makes people reflective, it makes people thoughtful in a way that they are not in everyday life. That's entirely normal. And I think we should expect this flexibility in the life cycle, as you would find between different groups of people or different individuals. Can you go to the next slide, please? And here are two ways where two phrases that I have worked on over many years. The one that is mostly associated with my writing is this notion of believing without belonging. And what did I mean by this phrase? Well, what I meant was something very, I was trying to capture a mood, trying to capture a way of thinking about a situation where it was hard to place people into concrete boxes and say they were like this or like that. And I very specifically asked people not to drive too hard on the definitions of belief and belonging. But what happened was that almost everybody did precisely what I asked them not to do. Well, that's life, that happens. Because they wanted to test this proposal. They wanted to measure belief and measure belonging and say, was I right, was I wrong? And all sorts of answers came out. But from my point of view, they had rather lost the point of what I was trying to say. Well, that happens. And one thing that I am very aware of is that the group that I was really trying to capture were people who would now be called nominal Christians. They would be the large majority of people who call themselves Christian, are not very active and would not be able to say very clearly what they believed in, but they were within the frame, if you like. Now, it's precisely that group which has disappeared or is disappearing. There are far fewer of people in that section of if you like, part of the mainstream, part of the consensus, but not active. More people have now stepped outside of the organized religion. That's the point we started with. And so was believing without belonging redundant? I wondered. But I'm beginning to think that the people we're seeing now and talking about this evening really do believe without belonging at all. And so in a way, the phrase captures a new group of people, not those who half believe and are inside the churches, though passively, but those who've left, but still retain some sort of belief. So I think it still has resonance, though it's being used in a different way. From around 2000 on, I began talking about vicarious religion. I'm not sure how well that translates into Czech. The crucial thing to get hold of is that there's a much greater stress on the institution rather than the individual. And trying to see how particularly the historic churches in Europe operated on behalf of, that's what vicarious means, that they stood for something, and even people who were not officially part of this were really quite positive about these institutions and quite glad that they were there, wanted them to stay, wanted them to continue, and particularly people have strong sentiments towards historic buildings, their places of memory, their places of gathering, of rejoicing, or of sorrow, and they stand for something even if you are not yourself a believer. Now, a number of these churches are now finding it very difficult to keep going, not the big ones, but the smaller parish churches in villages sustain their lives because of a generation of people who were very committed to them. It's pretty much the generation older than me, and there aren't that many of them left. And a number of these churches really are struggling. And I wonder too whether vicarious religion might be getting to its limits, as it were. This is not working as an idea any longer. It's also a parish model. It is a very expensive model. But then this, I think, is the form of religion, this notion of an institution that says something about us, usually a nation, because it's a national church, and has been rather hijacked, you could almost say that word. It's been deployed by those who are outside the churches often, or have very mixed motives, but they see a way of defending the nation state. Religion becomes part of culture. There's a legal change in this shift, which is a bit worrying because it becomes less susceptible to legislation about freedom of religion. But the really dangerous side of this, I think that I think is worrying, is growing populism, that the churches are taken over by those who want to defend a particular understanding of their nation or country and use it to exclude those who are not part of it. And you saw aspects of this in Brexit. It's fairly muted in Brexit, but if you look at Hungary, or if you look at Poland, or even in the Nordic countries in a Lutheran way, we are Lutherans, we are Catholics, we are Christians. You who are trying to come into our country are not. I mean, it's a very unpleasant dimension of modern European life. It's not something that we should be sanguine about, but it comes about, I think, as belief, as it were, melts away from the institution, and you're just left with the shell of the institution. And I don't like this. I see it in Europe, and I don't like it. I didn't expect this to happen, and I didn't expect believing without belonging to re-emerge in a new way. Remember that the unexpected can and does happen. Now let's move a little bit and think comparatively. So go to the next slide, please. And obviously, belief, the form of Christianity, the tradition, the organization, the history, church and state relations vary very considerably from place to place. I'm going to take 4 examples, and then we'll look at some slightly different ones in more detail. This is just to give you a flavor of what I'm thinking about. Take Britain. In Britain, there are 4 different, to be honest, I ought to say United Kingdom if I'm saying 4 different religious settlements, because United Kingdom includes Northern Ireland. Secularization is advanced in 3 of them, less so in Northern Ireland. And there's a degree of religious pluralism since the Reformation. The state church, the Church of England, has never been hegemonic in the way that the Catholic churches in parts of Europe are. And it's a relatively tolerant society, becoming less so. And if you have choice from the time of the Reformation, you find choice is, if you could choose your form of religion, it's not such a big step to choose to be outside that fold, if you like. If you choose whether you want to be a Methodist or a Baptist or this or that, to say I don't want to be anything at all is not such a big deal. The notion of choice has been in Britain for centuries. France, as you will know very well, is very different. Here you have the long-term conflict between the Catholic Church and a rigorously secular state. So the whole choice between religion and no religion or non-religion is politically quite different. There is advanced secularization again, but it plays out in a very different way. I'm always intrigued when I do a comparison with France. It's probably the country I know best apart from my own, because France is definitely more democratic than Britain. We have there is no state church. There's an elected second chamber. The king, queen went years ago, centuries ago. It is both sort of procedurally and constitutionally much more democratic than Britain, but it's less tolerant. That's for sure. So what is the relationship between tolerance and democracy? It's a side issue really for tonight, but it's quite an interesting thing to think about. Now, I put the Czech Republic in here, but I'm not going to presume that I know more than you about this. I'd be just very interested how you construct your own situation alongside other European countries. Long-standing secular tradition in the Czech Republic, but how does it play out politically and culturally? And remember, of course, that the US is very, very different indeed. Okay, it's got more nuns than it used to have, but it has a completely different starting point. There is no historic church, extensive but mostly Christian pluralism. Secularization is growing, but it came later. But currently we see increasing and somewhat dangerous polarization in which religion is clearly a factor. Now let's look at some more recent examples. And here I'm rather shamelessly introducing a book that will be published the day after tomorrow, this week. It's a book that I've co-edited. It's called the Oxford Handbook of Religion and Europe. You can now read quite a lot of it on the Oxford University Press website. You can also dig into Amazon. It is very expensive, so think twice before you click on buying it. But do tell your friends about it. I've learned so much in editing this book. And I'm going to point you to chapter 31, which is written by two English colleagues, Stephen Bullivant. I hope you will talk to him because he knows a great deal about non-religion. And a younger colleague, Josh Bullock, who worked with him. And it's called Non-Religion in Europe. It starts with a historical overview, but points particularly to a non-religious turn in around 2000. It works statistically, and then with three contrasting context-dependent case studies. So let's take a look at the statistical overview on the next slide. I find this a very interesting graph. The bars that go up and down are the total population. The line above is the under 30s. That comes out if you put these slides on a screen. You can play with that. It may not show now. So the line above is the younger generations, and the whole population is in the bars. And on the left, I think it will come out that way around, is West Europe, and on the right is post-communist Europe. So it's not West Europe quite how we always say it, but it's the post-communist countries that are on the right-hand side. And you see two very different shapes. The post-communist countries, they're not all there, are much more extreme, including the Czech Republic. And West Europe, you can see the pattern and the shapes, but it's not quite so dramatic. And you could look at that for quite a long time and think, I wonder why that is. I guess that's part of your work in a way. I find that a very, very valuable addition to a handbook, that people could reflect on that. And then if we go to the next slide, we're going to look at the first of the three case studies. And it's an English example. It's called the Sunday Assembly. It starts in English. It's spread around the world a little bit. And this is one of the best known examples of organized non-religion. In other words, it operates more or less exactly like a church, but without the theology. So you have the gathering, you have the singing, you have the preaching, you have the sociability and all that kind of thing, but the actual Christian or religious element is absent. And it's been going now for 9 years. You see who set it up. Two comedians, had various names, and it's now a secular congregation. Now the stats in 2019 saw this as a registered charity. That's what churches are in Britain, 41 successful congregations in 8 countries, including a strong presence in the US. Now, the really interesting thing about this is that they are finding life as hard as churches. That number is falling, and because they have the gathering and the need for the building and the leadership and all the other things, this has been very difficult, partly in the pandemic, but also simply sustaining that element. They come up against all the same issues as a religious congregation. I think your next slide has a picture on it. We can look at that in a minute. I think it's very interesting because at first, if you go to that slide, the first thing you see is people waving their arms. And you think, oh, that's an evangelical church. But in fact, the gesture is not at all what you would see in an evangelical church. The actual stance and the holding of the arms is subtly different. And you can see that quite clearly. And I should be very curious to see what happens to this congregation or these congregations in the next decade or so. Will they make it? We'll see. Now, my next example, after the picture, is from Norway. Now, Norway has a very well-developed humanist association. It is one of the largest humanist associations in the world in a very small country. But if you look again, I mean, if you look at the numbers relatively, it is, in terms of percentage of the population, the largest. And the way you can see the figures there, more than 90,000 members, 2% of the Norwegian population, and it's relatively wealthy because it is funded just as the Norwegian church is funded, which is through church tax. This is why the Scandinavian and up to a point the German churches are so wealthy, is that they are funded by the whole population, not simply by the activists. And what you discover is that the non-religious organizations in Norway are precisely a mirror image of the Lutheran Church. If you saw the first example as up to a point a mirror image of an evangelical congregation, and the importance of the Lutheran Church is the importance of membership, of belonging, of and this is why baptism, marriage, and people who have funerals in churches stay so high in the Nordic countries, when their reputation for being very secular is well earned. I mean, that's what they are. They're very secular, and yet they retain the membership criteria much more developed than it is, for example, in the UK or England. This mirror image provides ceremonies and rituals for life events, community gatherings and youth work. There's a big youth arm, and it is also a campaigning organization. If you look at the next 2 slides, both of which have got the images on, I ask you to be just a little bit sensitive about these images, because I'm not absolutely sure about the copyright. I think they're okay just to look at, but perhaps we should be a bit careful in circulation. You see the second one, I think it's the second one, but the baptism looks exactly like a baptism. I mean, it isn't a baptism, it's a naming ceremony. But you can see how close it is to a Christian baptism. It's a parallel. It's people in Norway want that tradition, want that membership, want their child to be part of something, and yet not a church. I can't imagine that this would happen in England, and I don't know how you would reflect on the situation in the Czech Republic, but clearly this is a very important occasion in Norwegian society. And it's more developed in Norway than it is in Sweden or Denmark, but I think you find echoes of that, the importance of belonging, the importance of membership in all the Nordic countries. And my final example is a Polish one. I mean, they're all three in the chapter in the handbook. I don't think I can say that in Polish, so we'll call it the KLF.
Jo, krásně.
Thank you. Thank you. Founded in 2013 and with rather different goals: to inform the Polish public on issues relating to rationalism, to promote the separation of church and state, to popularize science and scientific method and establish a knowledge-based society, and to outlaw discrimination on the basis of worldview, gender, sexual orientation, race, or ethnicity. And a strong statement saying, without liberation from religious oppression, there will be no women's rights. There's a strong gender element in this. Without a secular state, there will be no democracy. Depends how you define a secular state, of course. And again, you'll see the pictures in the next couple of slides. Just look at those, and then we'll kind of look at the three examples altogether. So you find the Sunday Assembly in London, starting in London, functions like an evangelical-style church for non-religious people. Norwegian humanists provide structure and support for a constituency that still wants to mark life events with rituals and ceremonies. And the KLF promotes women's and atheist rights in the face of a populist right-wing government closely linked with Catholicism. So is your organization a parallel to what is found within the religious sphere, or is it an opposition? It's a parallel in the English case, it's a parallel in the Norwegian case. In the Polish case, it's much more oppositional. It's a very different atmosphere. Each organization responds to the context in which it operates and places itself on a specific rather than a generic spectrum of belief. So I've come back to the idea of spectrum, but I'm suggesting that it's not one spectrum across the globe, that each context, national or even local, creates its own spectrum, its own extremes, its own grey areas. I'm just going to invite you to expand that idea, which is quite a big ask at the end of a lecture, globally. And this I learned from David Martin, who was very important in my formation as a sociologist and a sociologist of religion. I met him 50 years ago at the LSE, and I kept in touch right up to the end of his life a couple of years ago. And he tells us in quite a not very well-known chapter, I think, published in 2013, I can supply you the reference, I think it's on the next slide actually, that there is a kind of big contrast on a global scale of two kinds of religion. One he calls transnational voluntarism, typified by Pentecostalism. The other are forms of religion based on a closed market which regards certain territories as their sacred preserve. And there is an isomorphic relationship between kin, ethnicity, and faith. The point is, in the first case, if you change your religion, if it's a voluntarist activity, you can choose. But in the second case, on the closed market, where the territory is a sacred preserve, if you change your religion, you may find you are changing your family, your friends, even your possibility of citizenship, or even in terms of your own life. Conversion in or out of a religion is an exercise of choice, but it has an entirely different meaning, consequence in each case. And if you go to the next slide, you see that this is a spectrum again. There's the reference for you too. At one end, you have North America, where, to be honest, I was very fascinated by this when I first began working in the field, that Americans do studies of what they call switching, which means you change your religion and why you change it from what to what. And of course, it can be a very important decision for the individual concerned, but the social consequences, economic consequences, aren't large. You can change your religion, in the morning, and if you don't particularly like it, you can change back in the afternoon. It's something. It is serious. I don't want to trivialize it, but it's not a big deal in terms of wider costs of, as I say, communities, friends, that kind of thing, or politically or economically. West Europe is somewhere in the middle. We'll come back to that. But if you get, say, to an Islamic territory, the Arabian Peninsula, you can't change your religion. The costs are enormously high. And so the meaning of becoming non-religious is utterly different. So that's where the meaning of the word is so important. What does it imply to be no religious? Did it incur cost? Did it incur advantage? It varies hugely. And I think Europe is very interesting because in West Europe, to be honest, changing your religion is not a big deal. But in Orthodox Europe, it is a little bit more challenging. I mean, look at the Greek constitution, which is a document we can all observe. There's nothing ideological about saying looking at the Greek constitution. You all can do that online. It's very easy. And you find, proselytism is banned, but the Orthodox Church is in a completely different situation from any other. And so changing a religion there is, it's a lot of people can say, I'm Orthodox, without having much contact to it, but they still feel very much that they're part of the Greek culture, and Orthodoxy is part of that. It's not better, not worse, it is simply different. David is very perceptive on that. I do commend that chapter. And then we just do the last couple of slides, really. And here, I'm sure you are doing this already, but I do commend the Pew Foundation to you, which has this wonderful, wonderful website, the Pew Forum, where you can spend many hours gleaning new things about religion, and it's extremely user-friendly. You can navigate around it very easily. And I come across these two sets of data. The first is the changing global religious landscape. I've put the links onto the slides which you now have. What you see is a very interesting trend, or what the people who created the data sets wonder. You see that it's likely that babies born to Muslims will begin to outnumber Christians by 2035. But you also see a fact which has been observed by more than one scholar, is that people who claim they have no religion, or state they have no religion, have fewer children than those who have religion. And so you get this kind of self-limiting of the number of secular people on a global scale. Now, I think it would be very, very dangerous to extrapolate from this observation. We'll see what happens. but it's what the Pew people speak of as a birth dearth. In other words, that the number of children to non-religious households is, it seems, smaller than the number of children born to those who have a strong faith. And Muslims are likely to outnumber Christians before too long. Now, I'm not going to put my money on that. I'm simply going to draw that to your attention and set it against another set of data entitled The Age Gap in Religion Around the World, where you see consistently that young adults tend to be less religion than older people. And the opposite is rarely true. Now, put those two together and begin to ask yourselves questions. I don't know what it will look like in 25 years. I won't see that, but my students will. And I'm really not quite sure what will happen. I mean, the falling in the number of children right across the world is dramatic at the moment. And so something is happening, but quite how fast and how the balances will work out in the next decades, I think is a very open question, but it's an interesting comparison, interesting pair of websites, different data sets that you can think, which one persuades me more? How is this going to work out in the long run? And where do we place ourselves on that? And so I conclude just about on time, I think. When I think about these global trends, I come back to some very crucial questions about Europe, which intrigue me. I have written a book called Europe, the Exceptional Case. And in it, I ask the following question. Is Europe secular because it is modern? Or is Europe secular because it is European? In other words, Europe modernized earlier than most places in the world, and it also secularized sooner than most places in the world. But what is the link between modernization and secularization? Is secularization intrinsic or extrinsic to modernity? Does it happen necessarily, or is it a particularly European phenomenon for European reasons? And goodness me, we've already seen that there's a huge variety across Europe, so we need to be careful about generalizations anyway. I very much like the idea of modernities being multiple. That's Shmuel Eisenstadt, the Israeli scholar. I think that was a very useful insight that a lot of people have worked on. And I think I go with the notion that secularities are multiple. And I'm sure you're in touch with the very impressive team in Leipzig who are working on the notion of multiple secularities. The notion I don't like is postmodern or post-secular or late modern, because I see modernity not as something that happened and stopped and now it's post-modernity. I see modernity and indeed secularity as something that continually evolves. We have different stages of modernity and different stages of secularization, and they ebb and flow. That again, I learned from David Martin, that secularization is not a unilinear narrative. It happens differently in different places, and it ebbs and flows. You can have religious thrusts and secular recoils. And I think we need to take these complex trends into account when we're trying to understand what is happening across Europe. and they're not well served by the notion that once it was secular and now it's post-secular. I think that doesn't help me, but I do like the notion that there are different trends in different places because the framing and the framework, as it were, pushes and pulls in a different direction. Clearly, we need to look forwards as well as back, noting that the unexpected can and does happen. Thank you very much for listening. I've enjoyed being with you this evening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Oh, it's nice. I can see you all now.
Yeah. Thank you again. I would suggest that you will publish new book. After that you publish Believing Without Belonging. You should publish Belonging Without Believing.
Well, that's really what Vicarious Religion is. I think that's what I did when I published the book on Europe, and it's not the subtitle, but perhaps it should have been. But I take your point. I take your point. Yeah.
Thank you very much, and I open now the floor for questions. You are free to ask. Just you can raise your hand or write your question to the chat box. So please, you can start. Maybe I will have first question. Very quick. Can I have?
Yes.
Yeah. My question is very simple. Do you see some change in the time of the pandemic? We saw some statistics that more people start to ask new questions. There is a significant change of values of the people because they see how fragile is the living here. So do you see some really big change in all those aspects that you just mentioned?
I think the pandemic will change everything. I think the important thing is it's not simply changing religion, it's changing right across the, I mean, for example, there are quite a lot of studies done about religion online. You know, and this I think is a very, very interesting phenomenon. And I mean, I have written a short article on that, but it's hugely varied because the way people, different churches do it in different ways. But the one thing for Europe that's very interesting is that traditionally, at least historically, Europe is a parish church with a territorial base. I mean, not everybody observes that, particularly in urban areas. But if you can, religion online means you can attend anywhere, absolutely anywhere. I mean, you can go to a cathedral where the music is if you were allowed to have music, that was a bit complicated. But you can be attracted to where there's good preaching. You can be you can go to your son's or daughter's church in the US. You know, there are absolutely no limits. And I think if you think that the real heritage of European religion is territorial, something very important is happening. But it can also be extraordinarily intimate. One of the things that happened in Exeter, I mean, there's a bit of a backstory here, but I won't go into that, that the choral scholars at the cathedral took it in turns to sing Compline every weekday night, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday maybe. One quite young person singing Compline in their own house because they couldn't go anywhere. And this was on Zoom. And people listened. It became quite attractive. Obviously, people listened all over the world. And so the physical distance was huge, but the intimacy of you and one other person was very strong. And so you get very different kind of interactions happening. And what you have to work out, of course, is some things work online and some don't. So that was one thing. But you also have to remember, of course, that our shopping was online, our schooling was online, our work was online. So don't think of religion as a discrete thing. It was a much bigger shift. Quite apart from the question you really asked me, which was, what does this do to values and the way people think? I think we've barely begun to find out, to be honest. I think it's going to change a lot, but it's almost too soon to say. People react differently, but I'm sure there are more people thinking about existential issues than you might have found had there not been a pandemic. I think that is true. Now, what that means in terms of religion or traditional religion, I think is quite complicated, but it's certainly an important question. But I mean, I don't know whether you can embed that a little bit in your project, but there will be project after project on the pandemic and how the influence that it has had. I did a very interesting thing 6 weeks or so ago. I did a debate with a French colleague on the place of the church in France and in Britain. And I could not believe how different. I thought I knew a lot about France, but the differences were striking. For example, one thing that happened in England were cathedrals became places of vaccination. So did mosques. But to introduce that idea to a French audience was deeply shocking. That they couldn't understand it. This would have been very repelling for French people, whereas British people thought, "Gosh, I hope I get my jab in a cathedral. That would be nice." And then there were very different aspects of in Britain, evangelicals, both inside the Church of England and outside it, were almost euphoric that they didn't have to worry about their buildings. They have a very strong preaching ministry. They could forget the building needed repair, that the roof was leaking, that this or that or the other was happening. They just took the microphone and preached. But there were other much more traditionalist people, or people with a different ecclesiology, for whom closing the building was a very difficult decision. And they really missed the presence of the building, even if they were declared no religion, they wanted those buildings back. That was very strong. There's evidence for that.
Okay, thank you very much. We have several questions already, and the first was Peter Jonkers.
First of all, thank you for your very insightful and illuminating lecture. If you don't mind, I would like to come back to your famous expression, believing without belonging. And you expressed some hesitancies about that. But my question would be, and I connect that with Linda Woodhead's talk a few weeks ago, that, well, the concept believing without belonging implicitly refers to a certain religious tradition, how loosely defined, but nevertheless. To her and my opinion, this link with the religious tradition is becoming almost increasingly vague. And that's why I suggested in an article I wrote whether the term longing without belonging would not be more accurate to cover the most recent trends. So could you comment on that problem, please?
Did you say longing without belonging?
Longing. So it kind what Germans would call, if you know German, Sehnsucht, a kind of indefinite longing for something beyond, without any specific link to a religious tradition, or very, very vaguely. And that's what Linda Wood had noticed. Well, of course, you know her famous research in a village in Britain.
Yeah.
And she revisited the village a 15 or 20 years later, and she found out that this link to a specific religious tradition was, well, fading away.
I think she's right. I think she's right. And I go back to what I intended when, I mean, sometimes you find you've written something and everybody takes it in wherever they want to take it. I meant to capture a particular time period, if you like. I mean, it's now 30 years. And where you could still see a significant number of people semi-attached to their churches. What you want to call it, I really don't mind. I called it believing without belonging, and everybody thought, you know, they all began to write about it. And as I said to you earlier, they reified it too much. They you know, I'm going to measure belief like this, whereas I didn't intend that. I was just capturing a mood. And then they measured belonging, and then belonging means this and that and the other. And yes, she's right. No, she's wrong. And so it went on. I think it's much more subtle than that. So I don't think Linda and I are so far apart. I think she's perfectly correct to say that what people are thinking is now more and more and more detached from the tradition because they don't know the tradition. Whereas 30 years ago, that's more than a generation. A lot. I mean, one of the things I have learned is that the time scale for religious change is a generation, and we're losing the generation a little bit older than me, not much now, and they had quite a strong grasp of scripture, of Sunday school, of narrative, could say the Lord's Prayer, and all sorts of things like that have simply disappeared. And you know, children, my children and grandchildren, I can simply see this happening. Now, what they kind of think instead, I think, is what Linda and her colleagues are probably finding out. So I think probably the difference between us is partly generational, and partly that what I call belief is not really so far from her longing, or your longing. So I think it's I wouldn't separate the two too sharply, but I do think there has been a very marked change in 30 years.
Yeah, that's what, if I'm correct, your colleague Danielle Hervieux-Légier refers to as the exculturation of Christianity, basically.
Yes, yes. Danielle is her work is quite hard to understand, and it particularly when you translate into English, my English students used to find it very difficult. But I think you're correct.
Thank you.
Yeah, and this chain of memory, you know, that she talks about, the chain of memory, has that chain broken? And what happens when it does break? Do you reconstitute new memories? There was quite interesting work done in going back to the question about the pandemic. Quite interesting work done in England, Britain, about buildings again. How many people who place themselves right outside the tradition really do care about these buildings, and you know, they felt shut out. They were very critical of policy that closed these buildings. I mean, the first months of the pandemic, I mean, it's not really much easier now. There was a lot of overreaction, or what seemed a bit like overreaction of you know, you couldn't even go into a church to pray. But then, you know, if you went in to pray, did somebody else have to be there to make sure this or that or the other? And, you know, what would happen if somebody touched what you'd touched? We were very uncertain, and the rigidity was very strict. But you saw amongst people who are outside the tradition, the longers, if you like, they still wanted their points of reference. So I think it's quite complicated, but I don't really disagree with Linda. But I do think she is younger than I am, and she's looking at a different generation.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have next question in chat by David Václavík. He wrote, unfortunately, I have a microphone problem, so I'll take the liberty of asking my question via chat. In your lecture, you mainly mentioned groups that have an active relation with religion, accepting or rejecting it, or defining themselves against some form of it. But what about the group of people who are indifferent to religion, ignore it because it is not essential to their personal and social lives?
I think I would place that group of people, which is very considerable, in the grey area. I mean, they simply live their lives in a different register, and that is perfectly possible in many parts of the world, but not quite all. I respect that question, and I think probably whoever asked it is correct in saying I didn't address it perhaps as closely as I could. It's quite difficult to address people who are indifferent, to be honest, because you can't. I mean, how are you going to do it? You can observe that they're there, but it's much harder to get a resonance in terms of any kind of question, because it simply doesn't. I mean, they just are indifferent. Are they really indifferent? I mean, that's a question to ask. Are they always indifferent? Would they be indifferent at the time of a death? Would they be indifferent at the time of a birth? Some would. I think I might just pass the question back to you as your inquiry develops as to how you do research indifference. I think it's a challenging, good question, and I think to get an empirical answer on it is quite difficult. Does anybody else have an answer to that, or add to the conversation?
Okay, we can wait for the next chat by David Václavík.
Yeah, please do.
In the meantime,
you can't say anything. Yes.
Exactly, he is silent. That's why he dismantled his microphone. So next questions. Professor Pavel Dušek have a question. So here from the studio in Prague.
Good evening, and thank you very much for your very stimulating lecture. My question, can you hear me well?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. My question is related to the Central and Eastern part of Europe, particularly the post-communist countries such as the Czech Republic and Hungary and Poland and Slovakia and so on. I know you referred to us being local people and therefore presumably experts on what's going on here, but still I would be really interested in how do you understand the difference in the public role of religion, or in the type of secularization processes in the Eastern post-communist part of Europe and the countries you do most of your research in, like Great Britain. Because your book, Europe, the Exceptional Case, has been translated and published in Czech. And many scholars here wondered, well, how does the Central and Eastern post-communist Europe fit into the picture, into the general view of European versions of modernity and secularity? And do you have any reflection on that?
I think, in fact, the slide that I showed you, which had the graph of the two sides of Europe, and the shape was very different, and Central East Europe had much bigger extremes. Now, do you know David Martin's little book called Forbidden Revolutions? In the 1990s, quite early on, quite soon after '89, David wrote a book called Forbidden Revolutions. I love this book. It's quite short. It's really 3 essays. The first one is a theoretical account, and I can't remember which order they come. The second one, I think, is on Latin America, and the third one is on Central East Europe. And one of the things that is very striking about post-communism, and in fact, what happened under communism, was that you disturbed something that's pretty central in West Europe, which is the strong links between church and state. I mean, many of them have been shattered. I mean, in the French case, very sharply. In the British case, the English case, they're still half there. They vary across Europe, but there was a kind of collusion of church and state for over centuries. Now, under communism, of course, that's shattered completely, and so the historic churches in East Central Europe become the carriers of an alternative memory, as opposed to the dominant memory. And he sees that as hugely significant. But I mean, how it's worked out since is so varied in different places. It's hard to generalize about Central East Europe. I mean, for a start, I would ask you, do you see the Catholic countries as significantly different from the communist countries, from the Orthodox countries? I mean, is that a more a stronger? I mean, is that schism from the 11th century more influential now than the communism, post-communism? In the handbook that I did mention, the one coming out this week, there are some good chapters on Central East Europe. My colleague who worked with me, Lucian Leustean, who is Romanian in origin, was absolutely adamant that the Orthodox tradition should be part of the book. You know, we were not to talk only about West Europe. So it's very well balanced in terms of East and West Europe, and some good chapters on post-communism and that kind of thing, and what happened in different parts of East Europe. So that might be a good place to look. I think, I mean, in terms of the thing that I said about David Martin right at the end of when I was speaking about how easily you can change your religion, how easily you can escape from heritage, that freedom can be, I mean, nothing happens to you if you cease to be an active Orthodox person in Greece or Romania, but it's not quite the same as ceasing to be an Anglican. It has a different register. But can you generalize, or is, you know, the Czech Republic so different from Poland that you would have to think differently about them? What about Estonia and Lithuania? Both Baltic states, but extremely different. As indeed you have the Netherlands and, you know, Italy. I mean, they are very, so you're always sort of working, you know, a little bit between. This is one way of thinking of it, but there are many variations. Now, whether you can find one model in which you can contain the whole of Europe, or whether you have to have more than one model in order to accommodate its different histories, its different confessions, I think it depends a bit what you're talking about. What I do think is the one thing that holds us all together is the territorial past, and nation, diocese, and above all, parish. That exists from one end of Europe to the other. It does not exist in the US, where the model, the building block in the US is congregation. It's very different. So there, I think you can get similarity, but I fully accept that the range across Europe is just huge. It's just huge. And it's sometimes difficult to be able to say things that resonate in different places. Believing without belonging jolly well did. Everybody talked about it. And vicarious religion works much better in some parts of Europe than others. You try talking about vicarious religion in the US. You're wasting your time. They cannot understand it. Because, you know, the notion of a state or anything working on your behalf in the US just doesn't resonate. So it's a kind of mixed answer. I think there are some points in common, and I think probably the territorial nature of the history is one of them. But it's fragmented and broken up in different ways in different places, and you get blocks and you get particular countries that are very different from those surrounding them, and you just got to take that into account. Hard work, but very fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Before I give a chance to Tomáš Halík to ask, I would like to read you the question by David Václavík very quickly. I totally agree with you. It is very difficult, but also very important. I ask this question because, at least according to the latest existing data, a large portion of the Czech population views religion as something that is actually uninteresting and unimportant to their momental lives. Still, at the same time, they do not, at least explicitly, deny the possibility of some form of the supernatural, nor do they deny that religious practices can be helpful. But they claim that they don't need them. It seems to me that in this respect, Czech society resembles Scandinavian societies as analyzed by Phil Zuckerman, concerning the phenomenon of non-religion.
I entirely agree, but where I you know, Phil Zuckerman's book on Denmark, okay, I like Phil and I've talked with him over the years, but he completely left out of that account the really rather dark dimension of Danish society, which was so excluding of Muslims. And if Muslim practice or Muslim, it was around the time of the Mohammed cartoons. And that, in a way, is a rather different, brings a rather different element into the conversation. This is one reason why I tried to say religion is drifting out of private life, indifference, but it's coming back into public life. And when it does come back into public life, people resent it. They don't want it. But there it is. And that's because of growing diversity. You can't just say, I'm indifferent to diversity. It's there. And it's troubling the whole of Europe. No doubt about it. No doubt about it. I mean, I'm deeply disturbed by Eric Zemmour in France. I mean, what is going on? I find that quite unnerving. How many French people resonate with him because of his very intense dislike of Islam? And I mean, I heard somebody, I can't remember what the context was, but all over Europe, I know what the context was: the Pope going to Lesbos. You know, his generous attitude to refugees, his welcome. But all over Europe, you see European countries closing their borders, Britain included. They are excluding. This is the use, sometimes, not always, but the use of the Christian narrative to exclude rather than include. You're not one of us. And so that indifference becomes a little bit stained. Can I say that? And is there an echo of that in the Czech Republic? I don't know.
Yes.
I think I have picked up bits of that. You know, I mean, it's obviously not as developed as the Hungarian case, but and then you find Danish people who are very, very secular, claiming their sort of Lutheran heritage to protect themselves, to protect their country. The Swedes did it, and they are very, very secular. It's muted, it's understated. Almost everything in Scandinavia is, but it's there. So I would like to have a long conversation with David, at some point when his microphone is in better shape.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. You can see his face at least. And our time is almost over. There is a thank you from David to you. But the last question or comment goes to Tomáš Halík for conclusion.
Okay.
So, hello. I think in our country, there has been, our country went through 3 very different periods of secularization. The first one was a soft secularization, a cultural secularization at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. It has some sociological reasons because the Czech countries were very industrialist, with heavy industry, high education, and urbanization. It was a sociological aspect, and there was also the ideological aspect that modern Czech nationalism was connected with a certain type of interpretation of our very difficult religious history, the Hussite wars and this violent recotalization and so on. Then was the second part of the hard secularization during the communist persecution. I think that the communists in Moscow have chosen the Czechoslovakia, especially the Czech part of our republic, as a field of experiment of total atheization of a country. So the persecution was more drastic than in the neighbor countries like in East Germany, Hungary, and so on. But it has some paradoxical effect. There was sort of revitalization of religion as a dissent, as a part of the dissent against communism. Then, after the fall of communism, came another period of soft secularization because the churches of the great part of the churches, especially the clergy, was not prepared for this new cultural situation. Many Christians are not able to live without an enemy. They always struggled against the communist enemy, and then they must have another new enemy, the Western liberalism, and so on and so on. So there's a third period of secularization. The secularization did not destroy a religion, but transform it. There are some transformed sort of religion. And one aspect is the emancipation of many elements which were united in the traditional form of religion. I mean, ritual, spirituality, ethics, philosophy, teaching, and it was put together in this traditional form of religion. And all these elements have some tendency for emancipation, especially spirituality. So, and emancipation from the other part and the other element of the traditional religiosity, and emancipation from the institution, from the church. So now the church is confronted not with the atheism, but especially with the spirituality, which is quite strong, but it's it wants not to have nothing with the traditional churches, and so I think now we have two strong forms of religiosity. On one part is this spirituality, and at the other hand, the connection of between religious rhetorics, religious symbols, and nationalism, populism, and so on. We prepared at our Czech Christian Academy a new research project, the political misuse of religion, especially in the post-communist countries, and the possibility of resilience against this political misuse of religion, which is very strong in Poland, which is very strong in Hungary. I visited Poland now several times, and there's a very strong process of secularization because the church compromised herself with this links, alienation with the populist government. So the intelligentsia, the young people, the young generation is going out of the church. And I think it's now the chance for the church to and for the religion to discover new form. This political, this liberal politics needs some sort of spiritual inspiration and moral inspiration, but it cannot be this traditional type of religion, and especially not this alienation between populism, nationalism, and religion. But I think there is another possibility I see in this type of, in this vision of Pope Francis, this Fratelli Tutti. It's another option of religion, which is this transformation from Catholicism to Catholicity, to the more open, universal understanding of religion, which should be the way to this universal brotherhood he's speaking about. And I think it could be some inspiration for this spiritual complement to the liberal, to the modern liberal democracy. And there is the effects of many left liberals against the religion, because atheism is always a relational concept. It's atheism against a certain type of theism, of religion, and I can understand it if they are in opposition against this alienation between populism, nationalism, and religious rhetorics, Christian rhetorics. But I think it's very important now to develop a different type of presence of religion in our time.
I think I would leave that as a statement rather than as a question. But one of the moments that really, really caught my eye was it wasn't Fratelli Tutti, it was in Laudato Si.
Also.
And if you look at the journal called Nature, which is a very well-known scientific journal. I mean, it's every vice chancellor wants you to publish in Nature. That's the gold standard, you know. And if you look at the day that Laudato Si was published and read the leader in nature. It gives an enormous welcome to the encyclical, and says this has transformed the debate. It just takes it into a different register. The science is good. And he said that the most important thing is the disseminating power of the church, that no scientific community can match this. And it was, I never thought I would read that in my professional life. And it was echoed by The Guardian in England, which is a pretty left-wing newspaper, that they simply embraced this encyclical as saying something really profound and important, not contradictory to science, but embracing the science. And I think the same thing happened with Fratelli Tutti. I'm talking about migration rather than about the environment. But I think it's the same kind of thing of offering a dimension that isn't passé, isn't something we don't need, it's something we really do need. You know, there's certain moments that you think, goodness, that's made a difference. And it was the scientific community that took the initiative. That was the most striking thing.
Okay, I'm very sorry, our time is over. Thank you very much. I understood when you spoke about the new forms that the COVID is changing. I had a very interesting experience that the church that I go to could not attend the building at all, and the church continued to work, just everybody from his home, but the church continues like without any physical building, and it works. And I'm very happy that we can have such a really very interesting discussions, that we are everywhere around the globe, and we succeeded to have such a very nice and interesting lecture. Thank you very much. Let me thank you on behalf of all of us, all of the Czech Christian Academy and the Faculty of Arts of the Charles University. Thank you very much.
May I thank you for your welcome. I've enjoyed it so much. Good luck with your project.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Děkujem vám všem taky. Nashledanou. Thank you all. Bye bye. Thank you.